The air inside the grand meeting hall was heavy, thick with the weight of centuries of tension. Captain Ethan Drake, a decorated diplomat from Earth, stood at the center of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the table in front of him. It was his responsibility to ensure peace. But peace had never felt so elusive. The Valar, a species both ancient and powerful, had been at war with humanity for decades. Now, Earth and Valar were trying to make amends. Drake had spent months traveling the galaxy to get here, to the distant planet Valar. The treaty talks were meant to bring an end to centuries of hostilities. But the deeper Drake got into these talks, the more complicated things seemed to become. The Valar weren't like humans. Their history was stained with blood. Their rulers brutal and unyielding. It was hard to forget that they were once enemies, the cause of countless human deaths. Even now, as Drake took a seat across from them, he couldn't fully shake off the ghosts of the past. The most important figure at the table was Princess Ishtar. She was the leader of the Valoran coalition, and a figure of both admiration and fear among her people. At first glance, she was stunning. Tall, poised, with silver hair that shimmered under the lights. She had a regal aura that demanded respect. But it wasn't her beauty that made her so dangerous. It was her power. Ishtar wasn't just a political leader. She was a living symbol of her species' psychic abilities. The Valar were telepathic, capable of reading minds and manipulating emotions. The princess, however, was said to be more than that. Rumor had it that her abilities surpassed even her own people's understanding. The diplomats from both sides were seated around a polished stone table, their voices low and calm as they discussed the terms of the treaty. Yet, even in the midst of this delicate negotiation, Drake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an undercurrent of tension in the room, and it was centered on the princess. She hadn't said much during the talks, only observing. Her cold blue eyes fixed on him whenever they crossed paths. Drake felt the weight of her gaze, like she was studying him, waiting for him to slip up. Finally, the time came for a private discussion between the two leaders. The room cleared, and only Drake and Ishtar remained. She motioned for him to sit, her voice calm and measured. "Captain Drake, I'm glad we can finally speak without the interruptions of others," Ishtar said, her voice a melodic blend of authority and grace. "I must admit, I find your people fascinating." Drake didn't respond immediately. He had been briefed on her skills as a conversationalist, how she could manipulate every word and make her target feel as though they were being carefully guided through a conversation. His instincts told him to tread carefully. "I'm sure humans are quite different from what you expected," Drake replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. Ishtar's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could say that. You see, humans have a remarkable way of surprising us. We have studied you for centuries, yet every time we think we understand you, you prove us wrong." Drake shifted in his seat. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he was starting to feel like the walls were closing in. Her presence was overwhelming, and her gaze made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Was it her psychic abilities at work? Or something else? "I'm sure you've heard many things about the Valar," Ishtar continued. "About our past, our history with your species." Drake nodded. "I've heard enough." The princess leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You see, Captain, you and your people still haven't truly forgiven us, have you? It's been decades since the war ended, but the wounds still remain. You've built your great civilization on the ashes of those who fought against you. And we have to live with the consequences." Drake's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time someone had brought up the war, but something about the way she said it, so calmly and so matter-of-factly, made it feel different. The past had always been a part of the present, but Ishtar seemed to carry it with a weight that Drake hadn't expected. "We didn't choose war," he replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Your people did. Ishtar's expression remained unchanged. Yes, and we paid the price for that. My father, he was a tyrant. He was the one who led the Valar into that war. But I was just a child then. I didn't understand the weight of the decisions being made. Yet, here I am, the one who must face the consequences of his actions. And now, you expect me to fix everything. Drake felt a knot form in his stomach. The princess's words were starting to make him question everything he had believed about the Valar. For years, humans had been taught to view them as the enemy. Ruthless, cold, unfeeling. But Ishtar's voice held no malice. There was only exhaustion, and perhaps a hint of sorrow. I never asked for this, she whispered, her voice softer now. I never asked to carry my father's legacy, but that is what I must do. Drake's mind raced. Could it be true? Was Ishtar really just a pawn in her father's games, trapped in a role that she hadn't chosen? Or was she simply manipulating him with her carefully chosen words, like so many before her? Suddenly, Ishtar stood and walked to the window. The view outside was breathtaking. Vast landscapes of purple forests and shining lakes. The beauty of Valar laid bare. The princess seemed lost in thought, staring out at the alien world she ruled. Drake stood up too, but didn't approach her. Instead, he spoke the truth that had been weighing on his mind. You want peace, don't you? But peace isn't just about signing a treaty. It's about trust. Ishtar turned slowly, her gaze locking with his. And do you trust me, Captain? Can you trust me, after everything? For a moment, Drake didn't answer. His mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. Trust was hard to come by after years of war. Years of being taught that the Valar were the enemy. But there was something in her eyes now, a vulnerability that he hadn't expected. Maybe we both have to learn to trust, he said, his voice quiet. The princess studied him for a long moment before she nodded. Perhaps. Perhaps. And then, she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a cold, calculated smile, but something warmer. A small, almost fragile smile that made Drake's heart race. For the first time in their meeting, the walls between them seemed to come down. If only for a moment. But as quickly as it had appeared, the smile faded. The princess's expression hardened once again, and she took a step back. I hope you haven't forgotten who I am, Captain, she said, her voice still calm, but now tinged with something darker. Drake froze. The words hit him like a sudden punch to the stomach. He didn't know why, but the weight of those words, spoken so softly, made him feel as though the ground had just shifted beneath his feet. He felt his hands tremble, his breath quicken. He stared at her, unable to speak. Ishtar's eyes bore into him, unblinking. The silence between them grew long and heavy, and in that silence, Drake felt something that chilled him to the core. A sense of unease that he couldn't explain. For a brief moment, he wondered if the peace they were working so hard to build was nothing more than a fragile illusion. The hours after the unsettling conversation with Princess Ishtar were long and tense for Captain Ethan Drake. As the human delegation settled into their quarters, Drake found himself restless. His mind kept circling back to her words. Have you forgotten who I am? The princess had been calm, almost serene, when she'd said it. But there had been something in her eyes that unsettled him. There was a weight behind her statement, a hidden meaning that Drake couldn't fully grasp. It felt as if she were daring him to uncover the truth, yet warning him at the same time. His instincts told him to dig deeper. He knew the Valar had a complex history with humanity, one of bitter war, destruction, and loss. But there was something about the way Ishtar spoke, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. Could it be true that she was different from the rest of her people? Could she be someone trying to right the wrongs of her past? Or was this just another act in a long line of Valoran manipulation? Unable to shake off the questions swirling in his mind, Drake decided to do what he did best: investigate. He couldn't trust the princess without knowing more. If she was going to lead the negotiations, he needed to understand who she really was. It was late in the evening when Drake finally managed to access the Valoran archives. The room was dark, except for the glow of his datapad, which illuminated his face in a soft blue light. He sifted through countless records, old and new, looking for anything that might explain Princess Ishtar's strange behavior. The Valar were known for their vast records of history, but they kept much of it hidden, especially their darker past. The war between their species and humanity had been brutal. Humans had won, but not without tremendous loss. Yet, in all the accounts, one name appeared again and again: the name of her father, Lord Kezar. A ruthless leader who had waged a campaign of terror against human colonies. Drake's fingers hovered over the screen as he read through the old records. Lord Kezar had been a conqueror, known for his brutality and psychic powers that were far stronger than any of the Valar before him. Under his rule, countless human settlements had been destroyed, entire populations wiped out. He was the villain of the war, the one who had pushed humanity to the brink of annihilation. But as Drake dug deeper into the records, something caught his eye. Ishtar's name appeared as well, but in a very different light. She had been just a child when her father's reign had ended, but there was mention of her presence at key moments during the final days of the war. She had been by her father's side, though not a leader in any official capacity. Her role in the war was unclear, but there was one entry that stood out. Princess Ishtar, heir to Lord Kezar, was spared from execution due to her young age and the tragic nature of her situation. Drake leaned back in his chair, trying to process the information. She had been a child, caught up in the legacy of her father's war. But that didn't explain her involvement in the current peace talks. Was she trying to atone for her father's actions? Or was this all just a carefully crafted lie, a way to gain sympathy and control? The next day, Drake met with his fellow diplomats for the morning briefing. The room was filled with quiet chatter, but Drake felt a gnawing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. Princess Ishtar was still an enigma, and the more he learned, the more complex she became. As the meeting began, his attention kept drifting to the image of the princess standing across from him during their last meeting. Her calm demeanor had hidden something he hadn't yet figured out. Was it guilt, regret, or something darker? At the end of the meeting, one of the human diplomats, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Sanchez, approached Drake. She had been his trusted ally throughout the negotiations and had always kept her sharp mind focused on the task at hand. "You seem distracted, Captain," Sanchez observed, her voice low. "Is something bothering you?" Drake hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I can't get Ishtar out of my head. Something's off about her." Sanchez raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "She's the key to the peace talks. We need her cooperation if we want any chance of making this work." "I know," Drake replied. "But I've been reading some records about her father, Lord Kezar. He was a monster. And from what I'm reading, she was there. She was with him during some of the worst parts of the war." Sanchez's expression darkened. "You think she's guilty by association?" "I don't know," Drake admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that she's hiding something. She's too calm, too controlled. It doesn't feel like the behavior of someone who's just trying to make peace." Sanchez crossed her arms and looked thoughtful. "Maybe she's not the one who needs to be watched. Then, maybe it's the people around her. You've seen how the Valoran military has been acting. If they see the peace talks succeeding, it could undermine their power." "I won." Drake nodded slowly. That was a possibility he hadn't fully considered. The Valoran military was powerful and had always been resistant to any sort of peace agreement with humanity. If they saw Ishtar as a threat to their authority, they might sabotage the talks altogether. Later that day, Drake was summoned to the royal palace for another private meeting with Princess Ishtar. This time, he was prepared. He had questions, and he intended to get answers. When he entered the grand chamber, the princess was already seated at a long, elegant table. She didn't look up immediately. Her gaze focused on a datapad in front of her. The room was quiet, and the atmosphere felt different, charged, almost. "You've been looking into my past," Ishtar said softly, her voice carrying an edge of something unspoken. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. I would have expected nothing less from a human diplomat. Drake stood still, a chill running down his spine. "I had to understand who I was dealing with. You've always been known as the heir to a warlord, princess. A warlord who destroyed countless human lives. You can't expect me to just forget that." She stood slowly, her posture regal. "I don't expect you to forget, Captain, nor do I expect you to forgive. But you must understand, I was just a child. My father's actions were not my own. I had no power to stop him. No one did." Drake's heart pounded in his chest. "Then why come here? Why lead these talks? If you're so innocent, why would your people follow you? Why would they let you negotiate peace when they've known nothing but war for generations?" Ishtar's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. "Because I'm the only one who can undo what my father did. I'm the only one who can offer a new future, not just for the Valar, but for humanity as well." Drake's mind raced. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that Ishtar was sincere, but the weight of her lineage still hung over them both. Could she really change everything? Or was she just another pawn in a game far larger than herself? Before he could respond, Ishtar's expression grew harder, her tone sharpening. "Do not mistake my past for my future, Captain. I will not let you, or anyone else, judge me for things I did not do. The past cannot be changed. Only the future can be forged." Drake stared at her, uncertain of how to proceed. She had shown a side of herself he hadn't expected. But was it enough to trust her? Before he could speak, Ishtar added, "And as for those who follow me, they fear what would happen if I fail. The Valoran military would never accept peace. Not with humanity, not with anyone. So yes, Captain, I am here because I have to be." As Drake left the palace that evening, his thoughts were a tangled mess. He had come to Valar with a single goal: peace. But peace was never as simple as it seemed. And with every step, it felt like the line between ally and enemy was growing more and more blurred. Was Ishtar a victim of her father's crimes? Or was she playing a dangerous game of her own? The answers, Drake knew, wouldn't be easy to find. But he couldn't ignore the pull of her words. She was right about one thing. The future could still be shaped. But whose future? And at what cost? The sun had barely begun to rise over Valar's horizon when Captain Ethan Drake received the urgent message. A small group of rebels had launched a surprise attack on the city, targeting the palace. The peace talks everything they had worked for were suddenly hanging by a thread. Drake's heart raced as he raced through the corridors of the human embassy. He had been expecting resistance, but he hadn't anticipated something this drastic. The Valoran military was powerful, but so were the rebels. And their hatred for humanity was no secret. Princess Ishtar had warned him that not everyone on her planet was ready to embrace peace. Now, it seemed, the rebels were determined to destroy everything they had built. He arrived at the palace's gates just as smoke began to rise in the distance. The sound of gunfire echoed in the air. Drake's mind raced. He needed to find Ishtar. If she was still in the palace, she was in immediate danger. Inside the royal chambers, Princess Ishtar was already standing by the window. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the chaos unfold below. The attack had come faster than anyone had expected, but she had known it was only a matter of time before the rebels struck. Her mind was sharp, her psychic abilities already at work. She could feel the emotions of the people outside. The fear, the rage, the desperation. But she could also feel something else, something more personal. She could feel Drake, his presence close, moving through the palace with urgency. As she turned away from the window, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Drake entered the room, his face set in determination. He didn't need to ask her if she was okay. He could see the tension in her posture, the strength in her eyes. "They've come for us," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. "They won't stop until they've destroyed everything." "We need to leave," Drake said, glancing out the window. The city below was already on fire. "Now," Ishtar shook her head. "We can't. If we leave now, it will be seen as weakness. The treaty will be over, and with it, any hope for peace. I cannot let that happen." Drake's frustration boiled over. "This isn't about your pride, Ishtar. People are dying out there." She stepped closer to him, her eyes intense. "It is about more than pride, Captain. This is about my people's future. If we run now, it will mean we've failed. I will not let my father's legacy be the last thing the Valar are known for. I've already lost so much. I refuse to let it be in vain." Drake felt a twinge of sympathy. But he knew there was no time for hesitation. The rebels were closing in, and every second mattered. He placed a hand on her arm, looking into her eyes. "Then we fight. We'll hold them off until the reinforcements arrive." For a moment, the princess hesitated, her expression shifting. She wasn't used to relying on others, especially not humans. But she saw the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't just offering help. He was offering a partnership, and that was something Ishtar had never known before. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady. "We'll fight. Together." The corridors of the palace were now eerily silent, except for the sound of distant explosions. The two of them made their way through the building, moving swiftly yet cautiously. As they neared the main hall, they could hear the sounds of combat. Valoran soldiers and rebels clashed, and it was clear the Valoran forces were struggling to maintain control. Ishtar led Drake through a series of hidden passages that only she knew. They emerged onto a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Below, rebels stormed the gates, their faces filled with hatred. There was no way they would stop unless they were stopped first. Drake and Ishtar didn't hesitate. They immediately took up positions, preparing to fight alongside the palace guards. Ishtar's psychic powers were a force of nature. She could sense the movement of the rebels before they even entered the palace grounds. Her mind worked with precision, directing the soldiers where to go, manipulating their thoughts to give them an edge. But even with her abilities, the odds were not in their favor. The rebels were numerous, and they were determined. Drake felt the tension in the air as he gripped his blaster tightly, prepared for the fight that was about to erupt. As the first rebel soldiers rushed through the gates, the battle began in full force. Drake and Ishtar moved together, their strategies in sync. The soldiers fought fiercely, but it was clear that Ishtar's influence was making a difference. The rebels were pushed back at first, but it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and launched another wave. "Captain, we need to get to the main control room," Ishtar shouted over the noise of the battle. "It's the only way to shut down their reinforcements." Drake nodded, realizing that the princess was right. If they didn't take control of the communication systems, they would be overrun. The palace would fall, and the rebels would win. The two of them fought their way through the halls, avoiding enemy fire and pushing forward with all the strength they had left. Drake had fought in battles before, but this felt different. There was something personal about this fight. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was about a future that could be lost in the blink of an eye. They reached the control room at last, but it was already occupied by a group of rebel commanders. The room was fortified, and the rebels had set up a defensive position. Drake took a deep breath. "We can't let them get away with this." Ishtar stepped forward, her eyes flashing with determination. She raised her hand, focusing all of her psychic energy. The rebels in the room suddenly stopped, their weapons lowering. For a moment, It was as if time had stopped. The princess's power was overwhelming. "I will not let you destroy what we have worked for," she said, her voice quiet but filled with authority. "Leave now, or you will regret it." The rebels hesitated. They could feel the strength of her will, but they weren't cowed. They were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. With a sudden burst of energy, they launched themselves at her. But before they could make contact, Drake dove in, knocking one of them off balance. He rolled to his feet, firing his blaster at another rebel. Ishtar's psychic power threw the remaining enemies against the walls, incapacitating them. In the chaos, they managed to access the control systems and disable the reinforcements. The remaining rebels had no choice but to retreat. They had lost their advantage, and with the palace defenses now secured, the battle began to turn in favor of the Valoran forces. Hours later, the dust began to settle. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. There were casualties on both sides. The rebels had been defeated, but their message had been heard. Ishtar knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, and the trust between her people and the humans would take time to rebuild. Drake stood by her side as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm light over the valley. The battle was won, but the true fight for peace had only just begun. "Ishtar," Drake said quietly, his voice carrying over the silence. "You were incredible." She looked at him, her face tired but resolute. "We were incredible, Captain. This isn't over. But maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of something better." As they watched the remnants of the battle clear, Drake finally understood. This wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about changing the future, building something from the ashes of the past. And together, humans and Valar would have to fight every day to make sure that future was possible.